The road to Vindobona was long, winding through the silent hills of Nauseam, where pine trees whispered in the wind and the morning frost clung to every leaf and blade of grass. It was early spring, and the cold had not yet loosened its hold on the land. Beneath the dull grey sky, the marching column of the 10th Gemini Legion moved slowly, their sandals clicking softly against the stone-paved road. Among them walked Gaius Marius, an infantryman of 27 winters, his thoughts as quiet as his steps. His lorica segmentada, though well maintained, creaked with every shift of his body. The iron of his gladius, sheathed at his side, was cold to the touch, but familiar, like a tool worn into the hand by time. He did not speak much these days. The others in his contubernum had grown accustomed to his silence. Instead, he listened to the wind in the hills, to the subtle clatter of armour and buckles, to the distant call of a raven sweeping overhead. The world was wide, and Rome, though mighty, often felt small beneath the vastness of the sky. Gaius had not seen his homeland in over 4 years. His family's villa laid beyond the Tiber, nestled near a grove of fig trees. He could still remember the taste of the sun-warmed fruit, the scent of rosemary in his mother's garden, the scratch of his father's beard when he kissed him on his forehead before his first campaign. The legion stopped to rest near a small glade. Before you drift softly into your slumber, I kindly request you to gently tap that like button and subscribe so you can find your way back to tomorrow's story. The pines standing tall and watchful around them. A creek ran nearby, its water clear and singing over smooth stones. Gaius knelt beside it, cupped his hands, and drank deeply. The coldness shocked him, yet steadied him. Around him, soldiers unpacked bread and olives, the sound of simple life returning in careful gestures. A soldier sharpening a blade, another writing a letter on a wax tablet, a third murmuring a prayer. A nearby soldier, Sextus, younger and always eager, leaned toward him. "Do you think we'll see battle again this spring?" Gaius did not answer immediately. He watched the sunlight scatter through the trees, casting shifting gold patterns on the ground. "I think," he said at last, "the earth wants peace more than we do." And with that, Sextus fell quiet too. Night had settled over the camp. The fires flickered low, ringed by stones and surrounded by men who had eaten their fill and now sat quiet in reflection. Some played dice. Others mended cloaks. The smoke curled upward, weaving through the pine branches into the deepening blue of the sky. Gaius sat apart from his tent mates, his back resting against a worn cedar trunk. In his lap lay a small wooden figure, a carving he had been shaping from olive wood since the march began. The features were crude, but it was meant to be a likeness of his younger sister. She had been barely 12 when he had left. In the lamplight, the figure's tiny face seemed nearly alive. The fire near him cracked sharply, and he looked up. Across the flames sat Centurion Aurelius, wrapped in his wolf pelt cloak, watching the men. Aurelius was grizzled, with a deep crease between his brows, but his eyes were kind. He caught Gaius's gaze and gave a slight nod. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked. Gaius shook his head. "Just thinking." "Ah," said the centurion. "Dangerous work for a soldier." They both chuckled softly. Gaius returned to his carving. "You ever wonder," Gaius said, his low voice, "if the Empire dreams?" Gaius looked up puzzled. Gaius continued poking at the fire with a stick. "We all march. We all fight. We all serve. But what does Rome dream of when it sleeps? Glory? Peace? Or does it remember the faces of the dead?" The question hung between them like mist. Neither had an answer. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of damp earth and smoke. An owl called in the distance. The fire popped. Dawn returned with a sigh of mist and birdsong. The camp stirred slowly, the soldiers rising with groans and laughter, brushing dew from their cloaks. A light drizzle had fallen in the night, leaving the grass silver-tipped and fragrant. Gaius wrapped his sagum tightly around his shoulders as he joined the others at the morning assembly. The standard of the 10th Gemina caught the first light, a flash of red and gold against the pale sky. An aquilfer stood tall beside it, the eagle glinting with fresh polish. The march began anew. Boots met stone. Shields shifted on backs, and the line moved forward like a river, steady and determined. They passed through a narrow valley, the path lined with blooming wildflowers. Gaius found his thoughts drifting. He imagined the philosophers of Rome, Censor Epictetus, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself speaking of virtue, of reason, of accepting fate. He thought of a line he had once heard, written by the Emperor in his journals. "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." The road curved, revealing a distant village nestled among the hills. Smoke rose peacefully from its chimneys. Children watched from afar, wide-eyed, clutching at their mother's skirts. One waved. Gaius lifted a hand in return, and then, quietly, he smiled. By the time the moon rose, full and pale over the horizon, the legion had reached the outskirts of a fortified post, a place where roads converged. Supplies were kept, and the weary could rest. Tents rose in neat rows. Fires lit the dark. A bard, travelling with a merchant caravan, offered a song by the outer fire pit. His voice was low and rough, but the tune was sweet. Men gathered to listen, many with eyes half closed, letting the music carry them far from the borderlands. Gaius sat with Sextus again, sharing a cup of watered wine and a slice of cheese. The younger man had a letter from home, which he read aloud in hushed tones. His sister was marrying. There would be figs and honey cakes at the wedding. "Have you ever thought of leaving the army?" Sextus asked. Gaius considered it. "I think of going home, of walking among the olive trees, of silence that isn't followed by orders." Above them, the stars blinked into view, and the moon, round and gentle, bathed the whole camp in silver light. Gaius lay back on the earth, arms crossed beneath his head, the cool night air soft against his face. Somewhere a wolf howled, the fire crackled, and in that moment there was no empire, no war, no fear. Only the quiet beating of a soldier's heart beneath a Roman sky. Morning came with a hush. The outpost at Cartanum stirred with discipline, honoured by years of repetition. Yet beneath that rhythm was something older, slower. The whisper of pine needles falling onto canvas roofs, the caw of a lone crow circling above the pargate ground, the scent of damp wood smoke drifting across the barracks. Gaius Marius woke early, as always, but he did not rise immediately. He listened. The wind moved like a low breath through the camp. Somewhere, a soldier coughed. Another muttered in his sleep. Today, they would not march. Instead, they would train. The morning drills began with shield work. The clang of gladius against metal echoed through the forest. Not with violence, but with rhythm, repetition, focus. Gaius moved with a practiced ease, his breath measured, his movements economical. The sun crept higher, throwing angled light between the trees, gilding helms and polished shoulders. Between bouts, he sat with Sextus and an older veteran named Flavius, whose tales always began with "When I served in Syria," and whose knees creaked louder than the camp's gates. They shared boiled eggs and bread, while the sun warmed the frost from their cloaks. "The Emperor writes philosophy, you know," Flavius grunted. "Sits up in his tent with a lamp and stylus, while we practice footwork." Sextus chuckled. "Maybe he dreams of being one of us." Gaius says nothing. He watched a line of ants making their slow pilgrimage across the stone. The shadows grew longer by noon, and by evening they stretched across the fields like sleeping beasts. The scent of pine thickened, and bird-song faded into frog-song. Another fire. Another bowl of barley stew. Another night beneath the stars. It was not war, but it was soldiering, and it was life. In the quiet after dinner, Gaius withdrew a folded piece of parchment from his satchel. It had been written months ago, perhaps longer. A letter to his mother, but he had never sent it. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes tracing the faded ink. Mother, the nights are long, and the hills stretched on forever. I haven't seen the Danube swell in the moonlight. I have walked through snow so still it made me weep. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see your garden. I hear the bees again. I smell the thyme in your hands. I do not know what I am becoming, but I am trying to stay kind. Your son, Gaius. He read the words again, slower this time. Then he tucked the letter away. Some truths are better whispered only to the night. Outside the tent, Sextus had fallen asleep with a half-carved piece of driftwood in his hands. The fire still glowed. The trees leaned close. And overhead, stars gathered like old friends returning. News reached the outpost the next morning. The Emperor himself would be passing nearby. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher king, commander, father of the legions. The camp was stirred, not by fear, but by reverence. Tents were tidied, armor polished, standards repainted. Even the dogs of the camp, it seemed, barked with more dignity. Gaius stood among his cohort as the emperor approached. He rode not in gilded triumph, but on a plain horse, clad in a simple cloak. His beard was streaked with grey. His eyes were distant but kind. He did not speak loudly, but when he looked upon the soldiers, they felt seen, not as pawns, but as Rome's enduring soul. The emperor dismounted to speak with a wounded veteran. He gave no speech. But later, in the hush of the evening, word spread. He had quoted Epictetus. Difficulties show a man's character. That night, by the fire, Gaius whispered the words aloud. He let them settle in his chest. Heavy, but not cruel. He wondered if Marcus Aurelius ever felt fear. If he, too, woke in the dark and wondered if the world could be better. And somehow, he believed the answer was yes. The next morning brought snow. Soft, slow, and silent. It drifted down in lazy spirals, settling on helmets and tents, cloaks and campfires, and the whole world turned white, and the soldiers moved with gentleness, as if they feared waking the gods themselves. Gaius walked alone into the forest beyond the walls. The trees stood tall and unmoving, branches drooping beneath the weight of frost. He found a clearing. He sat. No sounds, no voices, only the soft hush of snow. And there, in the stillness, he allowed himself to grieve, not for a comrade or a battle, but for the simple ache of having to be away for too long, for the days lost to duty, for the years that passed without figs or laughter. He breathed. He forgave himself. And when he returned to camp, a small bird followed him to the gate, fluttering just behind, silent as the dawn. The river was a ribbon of silver in the early morning light. Mist hovered just above its surface, wrapping the waters in a quiet dream. The Danube, ancient and wide, flowed solely past reeds and rocks, past the silhouettes of sleeping villagers on the far bank, past the memory of so many who had once crossed it under banners of conquest or defence. Gaius stood barefoot on the bank, his boots set neatly behind him. The soil was cool. The pebbles pressed into his heels as he waded a few steps into the shallows. Around him, the world was hushed but alive. The soft chirp of warblers in the trees, the rustle of wind through poplars, the gentle lap of water against his knees. He did not come here to wash. He came to remember the world moved even when men waged war. That water kept flowing. That fish kept swimming, shapeless and eternal. Sextus joined him a few minutes later, yawning. "Trying to talk to the gods again?" he asked. Gaius smiled faintly. Listening, more than talking. They stood in silence for a while. A heron landed across the bank. A fish leapt. Somewhere far off, a horn sounded. The beginning of the day's watch. They left the water slowly, the chill still clinging to their calves. Back to the camp. Back to duties. But a little of the river remained with them, flowing, steady. The smithy was the heart of quiet labour. By midday, the forge glowed like a second sun inside the workshop. Flames licked on the iron, and smoke coiled into the beams above. The blacksmith, Lucanus, was a broad man with arms like old tree trunks and a voice like gravel. He spoke rarely, but each word he offered was as carefully placed as his hammer on an anvil. Gaius had always found comfort in the forge, the steady rhythm of metal meeting metal, the transformation of raw material into shield boss, hinge, horseshoe. There was a purpose here, not in destruction, but in making. On this day, he helped Lucanus with a broken scale segment from a centurion's armour. They worked side by side, silent, except for the hiss of the quenching tub and the clink of tongs. Lucanus paused once, gesturing to the coals. Every fire tells a story, but it always burns away the weak parts first. Gaius nodded. He thought of his own scars, not the ones on his skin, but the ones inside. The things he no longer carried, the parts of him that had fallen away, like brittle scale under flame. By dusk, the armour shone with a dull sheen, mended, not new, but ready. And as the stars appeared outside, Lucanus poured them each a mug of watered wine and told a tale of Vulcan, god of fire, who built weapons not for wrath, but to protect beauty. The storm came quietly. First, a hush fell over the camp. The birds stopped singing. The scent of ozone thickened in the air. Then a single drop struck Gaius's hand. Then another. Within moments, the sky opened. Soldiers rushed to cover their gear. Cloaks were pulled over shoulders. Fires hissed and sputtered under the weight of water. But Gaius stood in it, face tilted upward. The rain reminded him of his childhood in Tuscia, of summers when he'd ran barefoot through the vineyards, grape juice staining his chin, his mother calling him in from the rows with laughter in her voice. He remembered the taste of the olives from his father's hands, the lilt of his sister's song as she combed out her hair in the shade. He remembered peace. And in that remembering, something softened. He walked slowly across the camp, his sandals squelching, until he reached the animal pens. There, beneath the sheltering eaves, was a young cavalryman, barely 16, shivering as he tried to calm the restless horse. Without a word, Gaius shrugged off his cloak and draped it over the boy's shoulders. Kindness did not cost valour. The rain continued through the night, soft and steady as a lullaby. And within each drop a memory fell, and from each memory something grew. Sleep came late that night. The rain had stopped, but the world was wet and gleaming. Campfires smouldered. Boots dried near tent flaps. The men's breathing rose and fell like waves. Gaius could not rest. He walked beyond the palisade, down a narrow path marked by old stones. He carried a lantern, but its light was small against the night. He reached a rise overlooking the valley. Below, the Danube shimmered under a half-moon. Above, the stars wheeled in ancient silence. He sat and listened. He thought of all who had walked this land before. Soldiers, farmers, poets, and kings. He imagined their footsteps in the soil, their breath in the wind, their stories half forgotten. And then, from nowhere, a memory surfaced. His father's voice, reading from Virgil. Perhaps someday we will look back on these things with joy. Tears came without shame. They cooled his cheeks in the night air. He whispered a prayer, not to Mars or Jupiter, but to time itself, to let us remember. Let us be gentle. Let us go on. And when the first bird sang in the pale light of morning, Gaius stood. He returned to camp and slept. The march resumed beneath a sky like woven silk, pale blue, rimmed with gold of late morning. The legion moved steadily, boots thudding in a rhythm that felt as old as Rome itself. Gaius walked near the front ranks, his pack snug against his back. The weight familiar now. Around him, the land stretched open, soft hills carpeted in wild thyme and short grass, clusters of trees shaped by wind and age. There was no urgency in this march. No enemy waited beyond the rise. Today's path was to patrol, part ritual, part routine. But to Gaius, it felt more like a pilgrimage. They passed a cluster of stone ruins, once a village, now surrendered to ivy and memory. A column still stood upright, worn but proud. A child's clay doll lay half buried in its path. He paused for a moment, the others continuing around him. He thought of how Rome left its fingerprints everywhere, and how time, like rain, slowly softened them. As the sun reached its peak, they stopped for water near an ancient laurel grove. The shade there was deep and green. Some soldiers napped. Others carved initials into bark or murmured poetry. Gaius sat alone, back against a warm stone, and watched a lizard sun itself. The air was thick with rosemary and pine. He did not speak. He simply listened to the buzz of bees, the creak of leather, the rise and fall of breath. Between each footstep and each silence, he felt Rome not as a city, but as a rhythm. That night, the legion camped near meadow. That night, the legion camped near a meadow veined with brooks. The grass here grew long and soft, brushing their knees as they pitched tents. A crescent moon shone above, pale and distant. After the evening meal, some of the younger men gathered near the fires. They passed wineskins between them and sang songs. Some bawdy, some ancient, and one, surprisingly, from the hills of Gaul. Gaius sat a little apart, his face warmed by firelight. He watched the flames dance and fade, felt the pulse of the earth beneath him. A legend. A legionary beside him, a Spaniard named Marcelius, hummed a lullaby in a language Gaius didn't know. It reminded him of his mother's voice. Just beyond the ring of light, fireflies drifted in lazy spirals. The meadow seemed to breathe, pulsing with unseen life. Sextus approached with a grin, flopped beside him, nudged his shoulder. You always stare like that when you're writing poetry in your head. I'm not, Gaius replied, though he was. Then I'll do it for you. O bright bugs in the grass, teach me your glowing ways, for I am but a weary man with heavy sandals. Gaius laughed, for the first time in days. It felt good. It felt whole. And somewhere, nearby, an owl hooted low, as if approving. At dawn, they reached a village painted in bright orchards and blues. The houses were small, but well tended, roofs thatched with care, fences woven from willow. Children played with hoops and sticks, their laughter trilling across the fields. The village elder welcomed them with a nod and a basket of dates. No ceremony, just hospitality. The soldiers helped mend a broken well. They sharpened tools, shared stories. A few taught the older children to march in straight lines, which caused much giggling. Gaius found himself repairing a door hinge alongside a man with a deep set of eyes, and a kindness that spoke more clearly than Latin. They worked quietly, exchanging gestures, pointing at tools, smiling. At midday, they ate flatbread with dried fruit in the shade of a pear tree. A girl with painted beads in her hair brought him a carved wooden fish. For luck, she said, in halting Latin. He kept it. When they left, the villagers waved with dusty hands. Some of the children ran alongside the marching column for half a mile, until their bare feet tired and the wind carried them back. And Gaius thought, perhaps peace did not always need temples and marble. Perhaps it bloomed in simpler places, between a door fixed and a meal shared. The wind changed. They smelled smoke on it. Not thick or urgent, but present. Scouts returned with reports of a broken watchtower, of missing cattle, of unfamiliar tracks. The rhythm of the legion shifted. Armour was checked, blades sharpened, rations packed tighter, voices lowered. That night, there was no singing, only the occasional murmur, the crackle of quiet fires, the click of a flint and steel. Gaius sat in his tent, oiling his gladius. His movements were calm, careful. He remembered what his first commander once said. Fear is not the enemy. Forgetting who you are, that is. He ran his fingers along the hilt, then reached for the wooden fish. He held it tightly, its grain rough in his palm. Outside, an officer barked orders. A mule brayed. The stars watched in silence. Sextus sat across from him. Neither of them spoke. They had seen enough battles to know when one was close, and that nothing needed saying. Gaius closed his eyes. He imagined the Danube, the forge, the pear tree, the songs. And in his chest, beneath the armour and the duty, he felt a quiet steadiness. Not bravado, not pride, but readiness. And as the night deepened, he slept, not soundly, but well enough. For morning would come, and with it the next chapter. The morning light was diffused through a gauze of mist that curled over the earth like wool pulled from the sky. The legionaries stood in muted lines, their armour kissed with dew, their breath visible in the cool air. Gaius tightened the leather straps around his chest plate, each motion deliberate, not rushed. No trumpets blared, no banners flapped with pomp. There was only the sound of preparation, the whisper of linen, the soft thuds of boots in mud, the murmur of prayer beneath helmets. The enemy was not yet in sight, but they were near. Across the hills, unseen hands prepared likewise. The world seemed to hold its breath. Gaius looked at the horizon where the mist met the trees. He thought not of blood, but of balance, of the weight of duty and the wish for peace. He rubbed the wooden fish in his hand and whispered his father's name. Each soldier bore something, a charm, a memory, a promise. Not one man stood empty. Sextus passed him and offered a brief nod. Gaius returned it. Words would only get in the way. A bird took flight from the tree line, wings slicing through the mist. It began. The clash did not come like thunder. It came like rain, in waves. A javelin thrown, a shield raised, the bark of command, the grunt of effort. Gaius moved within it, like one moves within a dance. They've rehearsed too many times. Feet steady, shield forward, thrust and step, breathe, pivot. The world shrank to small things. The angle of his gladius, the rhythm of impact against shield rim, the scuff of sand beneath his heel. A man lunged. Gaius parried. Another fell. Somewhere, Sextus shouted, and Gaius followed the sound like a lantern through fog. There was no room for fear here. Only muscle and memory and the narrow lane between them. At one moment, an enemy blade struck his helmet. The sound rang out like a bell. He staggered, saw stars, then ground, then the sky. But his hand found the earth. He rose again. He did not count how long it lasted. Only that when the noise faded, and the air stopped tasting of metal, The sun was lower, and he was still alive, and so was Sextus, and so were many. Not all, but many. After the clash, silence returned awkwardly, like a guest unsure they were welcome. Gaius sat beneath a blackened olive tree, his arm streaked with dirt, his left leg bandaged roughly. Around him, the camp moved like a body, injured but not broken. The medics worked quietly. The quartermasters tallied supplies. The centurions spoke in hushed tones. A small boy from the nearby village brought him water in a carved gourd. Gaius took it with a nod. He tried to smile, but his face was stiff. He thought of those who had not returned. They had names, stories, laughs. One had carved a bird from olive wood. Another sang in the morning, always off-key. One had written letters every week to a girl in Sicily. Now they were gone. Sextus lit a small fire beside him. The smoke rose in small spirals, curling into the dusk. Gaius did not speak for a long while. Eventually, he whispered, "It was a good fight." Sextus replied, "It was a necessary one." The stars began to appear. Neither of them looked away. Dawn broke slowly, as if uncertain whether it should return. The legion moved again, this time not toward battle, but toward memory. They walked more quietly now, not broken, but softened. The landscape was familiar, yet different. Fields that once shimmered with wheat now lay in stubble. Birds sang more cautiously. The sky, once endless, now seemed more intimate. As they passed the pear tree from days ago, a woman stepped from her home and waved. Gaius lifted his hand in reply. In his satchel, the wooden fish rested still, a small, gentle weight. A symbol of survival, of something carried through. They reached the ridge overlooking the valley, and below, the rooftops of a Roman outpost shimmered in the morning haze. Gaius paused, not to rest, but to feel, to remember the ones lost, to feel the ache in his legs and the thrum of life in his chest, to listen to the soft hum of the wind through the grass. Then quietly, he marched on. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of old leather, worn smooth by 1,000 feet and seasons. Morning came wrapped in fog, soft and heavy. It settled in the folds of the hills and clung to the cloaks of marching men. Birds remained silent, as if the world itself had chosen reverence. Gaius walked slowly. The rhythm of his steps no longer came from discipline, but from reflection. He carried not just his shield, but the stories of those who no longer marched beside him. In his mind, their faces flickered like candlelight. One had a laugh like water over stones. Another always marched with a flower tucked in his belt. There were so many details, and he held them all carefully as a craftsman holds glass. The others walked too, but with the same hush. It was as though they all understood. Memory has its own place, and today it set the tempo. A breeze stirred the mist, revealing groves of cypress and small, blue flowers bowing under dew. A day for remembering. A day for walking without haste. They came upon a stream, half hidden by reeds and thyme. Its waters gurgled low, clear as polished glass. Here, the column paused, not out of necessity, but because the place invited stillness. Gaius knelt by the water, letting it run over his hands. The cold was sharp, bracing, but welcome. He splashed it on his face, then watched as the ripples faded into stillness again. A heron stood nearby, its long neck poised in perfect stillness, as if part of the land itself. Sextus crouched beside him, elbows on knees. Do you remember the river near Vindobna? Gaia smelt faintly. With the black stones. And the fish that jumped when the centurion fell in. Both men chuckled, low and slow. The sound blending with the sound of water and rustling reeds. They sat like that for a long while. The stream whispered old stories to the stones. And the men, for once, simply listened. By the time they rose, the sun had moved higher, and the day smelled of a pine and warm earth. The road waited, but not impatiently. Toward late afternoon, they reached a hill crowned with wind-swept olive trees. At its base stood an old altar, weather-worn and mossy, ringed by tokens left by others who had passed. Bits of cloth, sprigs of rosemary, small coins darkened by time. Gaius stepped forward. The others followed, each quiet in their own thoughts. One by one, they placed offerings. Sextus unpinned a badge from his tunic. Another man offered a slingstone he had carried since his first campaign. A young recruit knelt to leave a simple riverstone polished smooth. Gaius reached into his pouch. His fingers closed around the wooden fish. He hesitated. Then he placed it gently among the others. The breeze stirred the olive branches. Light filtered through, soft as a mother's hand. No words were spoken. None were needed. The hill watched The trees listened, and the men walked on a little lighter. The walls of the outpost appeared over the rise like a memory long buried. The watchtower, the gate, the familiar timber of Roman order. Voices shouting drills, the ring of blacksmiths, the distant bark of a dog. But the men who returned were not the same as those who had left. Gaius felt it in his step, his breath, his heartbeat. The forge might still burn, but something within him had changed temperature. He passed through the gate and was met with nods, hand clasps, and quiet smiles. There was no parade, just warmth. He returned to his bunk, touched the beam where he had carved a laurel once, and sat. From his pack, he withdrew a piece of parchment and began to write. Not of glory, but of the wild time and stone villages, of old songs and fireflies, of loss and laughter, and things left beside a stream. The pen moved slowly, and through the window, beyond the wooden walls, Rome waited. Not just the city, but the idea, enduring and soft as a prayer. The clang of hammers echoed faintly in the pre-dawn hours, softened by the morning mist. Gaius stood in the armory courtyard, watching the forge rekindle. Orange light pulsed like a slow heart, and sparks lifted into the air like fireflies, remembering their purpose. He ran his hand along the rough stone wall, worn smooth by years of resting palms and tired shoulders. The blacksmith, an older man named Rufinus, nodded at him without pausing. His arms moved steadily, muscle and memory combined. Each strike was deliberate, rhythmic. "Armour doesn't sleep," Rufinus said, voice low like gravel dragged across silk. Gaius smiled faintly. "Neither do old soldiers." He took a seat near the coals, warmth brushing his face. The scent of burning oak and hot iron filled the air, familiar and grounding. Memories drifted in with the smoke, the ring of metal from his youth, his father shaping a spade, his first blade cooling in water. Time folded inward, and as the sun rose, golden across the cobblestones, the forge's quiet flame whispered of roots, of beginnings, and the strength found in shaping something from fire. The barracks were still, their wooden beams sighing as the day warmed. Gaius sat at his desk, a blank parchment out in front of him. The ink pot was full, the quill trimmed, but his hand hesitated. He had begun this letter many times. "Dearest mother," it would begin. Then nothing. What could he say of what he had seen? What words could translate the silence of waiting before battle, or the curve of sunlight on fallen comrade's cheek? He wrote, instead, of smaller things, of a cat that visited the barracks roof each evening, a village of painted walls, of a pear tree and the laughter of children. He described the feel of the cold water in his palms and the sound of distant owls. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it with the others in his satchel. None of them sent. All sealed with care. Perhaps it wasn't the destination that mattered. Perhaps the writing itself was the return. Beyond the outpost walls, near the edge of crumbling cliff, stood a monument half swallowed by ivy. No inscription remained, only faint lines, spear points, laurels, a figure with outstretched arms. Gaius stood before it at midday, the wind tugging gently at his cloak. He traced the carvings with his fingers. They were smooth, from the weather and reverence. Sextus joined him, hands clasped behind his back. "Do you think they were heroes?" Sextus asked. "I think they were men," Gaius replied, "who did their best." They stood there a long while. Below them, a valley stretched like a painted scroll. Vineyards, hills, and rivers winding like thoughts through memory. A lark sang nearby. The air smelled of lavender and dust. And in that moment, the monument did not seem forgotten. It breathed quietly in the presence of all those who still listened. Night fell like ink poured slowly over parchment. Gaius took the watch alone. He climbed the narrow stairwell of the northern tower, each step creaking like a whispered story. At the top, wind pressed gently against his face. The stars unveiled themselves, one by one. He rested his elbows on the stone ledge. Below, the land glimmered with a dew and moonlight. A fox darted through the tall grass. A distant owl called once, then twice. Above, the heavens turned silently. He breathed deep. Let the cool night air fill him. It was not a moment of glory, nor of sorrow, but simply one of being, of bearing witness. He thought of the march, the hills, the faces, the stream and the carved fish, the fire-lit songs and the worn sandals. The road behind him became a tapestry, and he, its quiet thread. He did not speak, but in his stillness there was a kind of prayer, and the stars, ancient and endless, kept him company. The morning came wrapped in mist, cool and silver. The legion had broken camp by a quiet river. one whose name had long slipped from maps, but not from the land's memory. It moved gently between its banks, glassy and wide, reflecting reeds that bowed in soft reverence. Gaius crouched by the edge, washing his hands slowly. The water was cold, but not unfriendly. It stirred something in him, something older than Rome, older than the march. He remembered a river from his childhood. It had twisted through his village like a ribbon, flanked by oak and wildflowers. He and his brother had chased dragonflies through the shallows, their feet caked in warm mud, their hearts buoyant. Here, now, in the quiet morning, he watched two herons rise from the water's edge, wings beating in unhurried ceremony. Their feathers caught the low light like brushed silver. Marcellus sat beside him without speaking. They shared a piece of bread in its stillness, dipping it in oil, eating slowly. The river hummed its old, wordless song, and for a while they were simply men beside water. No shields, no duties, just breath and reflection.